October 9th, 1943. The sky over the Baltic coast. A B-17F named Miss Nonalee II is limping north, one propeller feathered, engine dead, formation gone. The crew has just bombed the Arado aircraft plant at Anklam. They think they are heading for the safety of neutral Sweden. They are wrong. Within the hour, an intact, flyable American heavy bomber, the single hardest thing in the entire war for German engineers to get their hands on, is going to be sitting in a Danish field with German soldiers walking toward it. We're going to tell you everything about what happened next today, but I have to warn you that some of what follows is hard to sit with. Now, if you're still here, let's start with why this airplane, out of the thousands the 8th Air Force lost, actually mattered. This mission was not a routine strike. October 9th, 1943 fell in the middle of what the 8th Air Force's own history remembers as Black Week. 3 days of deep penetration missions flown October 8th through 10th, 5 days before the second raid on Schweinfurt that airmen would come to call Black Thursday. That day alone, 378 B-17s and B-24s hit 4 separate target sets at once. The Wulfe plant at Marienburg, the docks at Gdynia, the U-boat yards at Danzig, and the Arado aircraft works at Anklam. The target Miss Nonalee II's group had just left behind. The Anklam raid was flown deliberately as a diversion, a feint meant to pull German fighters north and away from the real weight of the attack falling on Marienburg. It worked in the sense that the Marienburg force lost only 2 bombers out of the 100 sent. The wings over Anklam paid for that diversion in full. 18 fortresses went down that day, drawing fighters onto themselves, and Miss Nonalee II, crippled but still flying, was one of the survivors of that toll, at least for another hour. By the time Black Week ended on October 14th, with the second raid on Schweinfurt, the 8th Air Force had lost 148 heavy bombers in 7 days, roughly 1,500 airmen, a rate no Air Force could sustain. The losses were bad enough that American commanders suspended deep, unescorted daylight raids into Germany for months afterward, waiting for long-range fighters that could escort the bombers all the way to the target and back. Which makes the timing almost too neat to be believed. In the very week that proved a B-17 formation without fighter cover could be bled white over Germany, German engineers were climbing into one intact example of exactly that airplane, trying to work out precisely how to make the bleeding happen faster. Part 1. By the autumn of 1943, German intelligence knew a great deal about the B-17 Flying Fortress, in theory. They had wreckage. They had interrogation transcripts from captured crews. What they did not have, in almost every case, was a whole airplane they could walk around, climb into, start up, and fly. A bomber that crashes at speed, burns on the ground, or breaks apart under fighter fire does not teach you much about how its systems actually behave in the air. An intact fortress, landed under control with its engines, hydraulics, turbochargers, and gun stations still working, was worth more to the Luftwaffe's engineers than almost anything else that could fall out of an American formation. The nickname itself said as much. A Seattle Times reporter had coined the name Flying Fortress back in 1935, watching Boeing's prototype rolled out bristling with machine gun positions, and Boeing kept the name for every production model that followed. By late 1943, the B-17F variant, flying missions like the one to Anklam, carried a crew of 10 and as many as 13 50-caliber machine guns, covering the nose, the tail, both waist positions, the belly ball turret, and the top turret, an aircraft designed from the outset to fight its way to a target and back, rather than lean entirely on fighter escort for the whole trip. That design philosophy, the whole logic of how the airplane was meant to survive contact with the enemy, was exactly what German intelligence needed to understand in detail, and exactly what a burned-out wreck could never really show them. This is why Miss Nonalee II's last flight went so wrong for the crew and so right for the Luftwaffe. The aircraft, serial number 42-30336, belonged to the 548th Bombardment Squadron of the 385th Bombardment Group, piloted by Lieutenant Glyndon Bell. On the mission to Anklam, the number 2 propeller lost pitch control, and Bell had to feather it, shutting the engine down to stop it tearing itself apart. Flying on 3 engines over hostile territory, the crew made the only sensible decision available to them. They turned for Sweden, a neutral country close enough to reach, where the aircraft and crew would be interned rather than captured. They missed. A navigation error took them over Denmark instead, occupied by Germany since 1940. 9 of the 10 men aboard bailed out and were picked up by Danish police, who were, at that point in the occupation, cooperating with German authorities. That left Bell alone in the cockpit of a dying bomber over enemy territory, with one job left: make sure the airplane never flew again under anyone else's flag. Part 2. Bell brought the B-17 down in a controlled crash landing near Norholm Mark, close to the town of Varda on the Danish west coast. On the ground, with the aircraft largely intact, he did what every American airman was trained to do in that situation. He tried to burn it. There was no time and no fuel supply he could reliably ignite before German forces arrived. The fire never properly caught. Bell himself evaded capture at the crash site, and Danish resistance contacts spirited him out through occupied territory to neutral Sweden, the destination the whole crew had been aiming for in the first place, though he reached it alone and on foot rather than by air. Bell was moving through Denmark at a strange moment for exactly that kind of underground network. That same October, Danish resistance groups were in the middle of a much larger and graver operation, ferrying roughly 7,200 Danish Jews and their relatives across those same waters to Sweden over about 3 weeks, after German orders to round them up leaked out in advance. Bell's rescue was a small footnote next to that effort, but it moved through the same country, the same month, and very possibly some of the same boats, and the same people willing to risk prison or worse to get someone across the water. Behind him, he left an airplane the Luftwaffe now owned outright, sitting nearly whole in a Danish field. This was not actually the first time this had happened. 10 months earlier, in December 1942, a B-17F named Wulfe Hound, flying with the 303rd Bomb Group out of RAF Molesworth in England, had gone down in a French hayfield after heavy fighter opposition tore into the formation over northern France. Pilot Paul Flickinger brought it down wheels up, avoiding power lines, and his crew tried the same trick Bell's crew would try 10 months later: stuff a parachute into a fuel tank and set it alight with a flare pistol. The Germans reached the aircraft before the fire took hold. Wulfe Hound went to Leeuwarden in the Netherlands for repair, emerged in German markings with the code DL+XC, and was flying German test flights by March 1943. Flickinger became a prisoner of war, escaped twice, and was recaptured both times. 4 of his crew went into POW camps. 6 evaded capture and made it home through Spain. By the time Miss Nonalee II went down, in other words, the Luftwaffe already had a working playbook for exactly this situation: secure the aircraft fast, repair what needed repairing, repaint it, and get it to Rechlin. If this story is landing the way it should, hit the like button right now. It helps us keep making videos like this one. Part 3. Rechlin was the Luftwaffe's primary test and evaluation center, the place where captured Allied aircraft went to be measured against German fighters and bombers under controlled conditions rather than combat chaos. Rechlin itself had a longer and stranger history than most of the aircraft it tested. Flight testing had gone on at the site since 1918 under the name Fliegerversuchs- und Lehranstalt until the Treaty of Versailles shut the program down. It came back quietly in 1922, years before Germany publicly admitted to rebuilding an air force at all, and was formally re-established under the name Erprobungsstelle Rechlin in 1926. By February 1936, an order from War Minister Werner von Blomberg made it the Luftwaffe's central and official test establishment, the place where the Bf-109, the Fw-190, and eventually the Me-262 jet were all put through their paces before entering service. Testing a captured American bomber there placed Miss Nonalee II in the company of nearly every major aircraft the Luftwaffe ever built. Rechlin itself would not survive the war intact. On April 10, 1945, it was hit by a raid of 11 B-17s and 159 B-24s, aircraft from the very Air Force whose bomber it had spent a year and a half evaluating, and Soviet forces reached the wreckage of the base 3 weeks later, on May 2nd. The man who came to collect Miss Nonalee II was Hans-Werner Lerche, a career test pilot who had been flying since he trained at a gliding school in 1931, and who would go on to fly 125 different aircraft types over the course of his career, an experience he later documented in his memoir, Luftwaffe Test Pilot, Flying Captured Allied Aircraft of World War II. Lerche got the call that an intact B-17 had come down near Esbjerg, flew up to collect it personally, and ferried it onward to Rechlin, where it was given the German test code 7+8. That code was not the aircraft's only identity. The four-letter markings air forces and aviation historians usually recognize, things like Wulfe Hound's eventual DL+XC, were factory or unit codes assigned once an aircraft was folded into a Luftwaffe squadron's paperwork. Rechlin's own simple numeric codes, plain digits separated by a plus sign, were something narrower, an internal filing system for the test center's own logbooks, marking an airframe as a subject of evaluation rather than a combat aircraft flying for any unit at all. Lerche was, by the time Miss Nonalee II reached him, already one of the most experienced men in this specific and strange profession anywhere in the war. By his own later account, he flew his entire career, well over 100 aircraft types, without ever crashing or seriously damaging a single one of them, a record almost unheard of in test flying, where damaged and destroyed prototypes were ordinarily just part of the cost of doing business. He had already put a captured Spitfire Mark II through its paces at Rechlin, and 8 months after Miss Nonalee II arrived, in June 1944, he would climb into a P-51B Mustang that had landed by mistake at a German-held airfield near Cambrai, an aircraft he later called, in his memoir, genuinely unique among everything else he had flown. The B-17 joined a logbook that already ran from British fighters to American fighters, and now to American heavy bombers. One professional's slow, complete tour of nearly everything the Allies were sending against Germany. What Lerche and the engineers at Rechlin found, once they put the aircraft through its paces, was not what a purely propagandistic account would predict. There was no single moment of horror or admiration. There was, instead, a careful, almost clinical set of findings, the kind that comes from professionals evaluating a piece of enemy engineering on its own terms. The most striking result came from deliberately testing the aircraft's ability to fly on reduced power. The B-17 could maintain controlled flight and make a safe landing with an engine feathered, exactly the condition that had brought Miss Nonalee II down over Denmark in the first place. And in further tests, Lerche found it could still be landed safely with 3 of its 4 engines out entirely. For a Luftwaffe used to designing and flying aircraft that were far less tolerant of battle damage, that alone was a serious finding. It meant that every American bomber the German fighter arm shot an engine off of was not, by itself, a bomber that was going down. Rechlin had a point of comparison sitting nearby. A captured B-24 Liberator, an aircraft American crews nicknamed Blonde Bomber II, had reached the base 4 months earlier, in June 1943, and Lerche had tested it as well. The verdict on that airplane came out very differently. Rechlin's engineers found it longitudinally unstable, heavy on the controls during a glide, and burdened with a nose wheel that was a genuine weak point, an undercarriage built for concrete runways that struggled on rough grass fields and reportedly collapsed on at least one landing. Set side by side, the 2 American heavy bombers told Rechlin 2 different stories. The B-24 flew faster and carried more, but it forgave less. The B-17, tested only months later in Miss Nonalee II, forgave a great deal, which is exactly the quality that had let Bell nurse it across the Baltic on 3 engines in the first place. The criticisms Lerche recorded were narrow and specific rather than sweeping. The forces required on the ailerons were relatively high, meaning the aircraft was physically heavier to bank and roll than German fighter pilots, used to lighter aircraft, might have expected. The rudder was similarly heavy. These were not flaws that made the aircraft dangerous or bad. They were the kind of handling notes a test pilot writes about a large, heavily built machine designed to carry 10 men, thousands of pounds of bombs, and enough defensive guns to fight off fighters in every direction at once. In other words, the B-17 flew exactly like what it was, a flying gun platform built for endurance and toughness, rather than a fighter's agility. And it did that job better than the German evaluators had necessarily expected going in. Part 4. Rechlin was only the first stop. Once the technical evaluation was done, aircraft like Miss Nonalee II and Wulfe Hound moved into a second phase of usefulness that had nothing to do with engineering reports and everything to do with keeping German fighter pilots alive. A captured flying fortress became a training aid, an actual full-scale target that German interceptor pilots could practice attacking under realistic conditions, learning firsthand which approach angles were hardest to fly through, where the defensive gun positions genuinely could not cover, and what the aircraft actually looked like from the cockpit of a fighter closing at 400 miles an hour, rather than from a diagram in a briefing room. This is also the point where Wulfe Hound's story took its strangest turn. In September 1943, it was transferred to Kampfgeschwader 200, a Luftwaffe unit built around special duties and clandestine operations, the same unit that flew other captured Allied aircraft for infiltration and unconventional missions behind enemy lines. Exactly how far its clandestine service went is harder to pin down than the technical record at Rechlin. One account places it on a mission flying agents out of southern France, a claim the paperwork does not fully confirm, but that fits the pattern of what a special duties unit would want a captured Allied heavy bomber for in the first place. What is documented is the broader scale of the program. Over the course of the war, the Luftwaffe captured roughly 40 B-17s and B-24s combined, with somewhere around a dozen to 20 B-17s eventually restored to genuinely airworthy condition, a small but real captured squadron flying quietly out of German airfields under Balkenkreuz markings. KG-200 itself was not formally activated until February 20, 1944, when two earlier special duties test formations were merged into a single unit under Werner Baumbach, with roots reaching back to a clandestine reconnaissance squadron Theodor Roell had run since 1934. By the summer of that year, it was operating something like 32 different aircraft types, with more than 100 aircrews, a scale far beyond anything the Miss Nonalee II or Wulfe Hound story alone would suggest. Captured B-17s, serving under KG-200, flew under a deliberately mundane cover identity, logged in some paperwork simply as Dornier DO-200, a bureaucratic disguise for an American bomber wearing German crosses. The unit held at least one captured B-24 Liberator as well, serial 41-28779, coded KO+XA, an aircraft its own crew ultimately burned in 1945 rather than let it fall into Allied hands intact a second time. Miss Nonalee II and Wulfe Hound were not curiosities kept quietly out of sight from each other either. On June 12, 1943, the Luftwaffe assembled a cluster of its captured Allied prizes together on the ground at Lars Airfield, not far from Rechlin itself. A B-17, a B-24 Liberator, a P-47 Thunderbolt, a P-51, a P-38 Lightning, a British Lancaster, a Mosquito, a Typhoon, and a Spitfire, standing side by side under German markings. A single afternoon's inventory of what German engineers had managed to pull, more or less intact, out of the war being waged against them. Part 5. Neither of these two airplanes got a quiet ending. Miss Nonalee II is recorded as still flying German test and training flights as late as December 1944, more than a year after it came down in that Danish field, meaning it outlasted its own capture by longer than most American bomber crews' entire combat tours. Wulfe Hound's ending was uglier and more ironic. It survived over 2 years in German hands, through Rechlin, through KG-200's shadow operations, and was finally caught on the ground at Oranienburg Airfield in Germany in April 1945, damaged in a bombing raid flown by the very Air Force it had once belonged to. Reconnaissance photographs afterward showed it sitting wrecked on the same kind of airfield it had once taken off from as an American aircraft. That wreck did not stay lost. Decades later, a researcher named Mario Schulze located the remains of Wulfe Hound at the old Oranienburg airfield site, and pieces of the aircraft that had flown for both air forces in the same war are now held at the Sachsenhausen Memorial, a strange final resting place for a bomber that started its life on Boeing's production line in Seattle. The flying fortress that had escaped destruction in a French hayfield in 1942 did not escape destruction from American bombs in 1945, on a German base, wearing German markings, more than 2 years and one entire war's worth of service to the wrong side later. The men who had flown it into enemy hands split into 2 very different wars of their own. Bell reached Sweden. Flickinger reached 2 escape attempts and 2 recaptures before the war ended. Of Miss Nonalee II's crew, 9 became prisoners of war for the duration. Of Wulfe Hound's crew, 4 went into the camps, and 6 made it out through Spain, with the help of resistance networks who risked their own lives to move them. The verdict. Why would a captured American bomber genuinely impress the people who captured it, rather than simply becoming a wartime curiosity? Because Rechlin's engineers and pilots were not looking for propaganda. They were looking for facts they could use to keep their own pilots alive against an aircraft that was going to keep coming over German skies in ever larger numbers, whether they respected it or not. What they found was an airplane that tolerated the loss of an engine, and then two engines, and still came home and landed under control. An airplane whose handling was heavy rather than nimble, because it had been built to survive rather than to dance. And an airplane whose defensive gun stations were thorough enough that German fighter pilots needed a captured example just to work out how to get close to one safely. None of that was the verdict of men trying to flatter an enemy. It was the verdict of men trying to solve a problem the American aircraft industry had just handed them, and finding, test after test, that the problem was tougher than they had hoped. They remember a Danish field in October 1943 and a French hayfield in December 1942. Two different crews doing the same desperate thing with a flare pistol and a fuel tank, and failing for the same reason. There was never quite enough time. They remember Lerche climbing into a cockpit built for a language and a training program not his own, learning its habits one test flight at a time. They remember German fighter pilots studying an American bomber's blind spots so they could fly directly into the ones that existed and avoid the ones that did not. Now you know what was in the file. Did your father or grandfather fly flying fortresses out of England in 1942 or 1943? Tell us his name and squadron in the comments below. And if you want more stories like this, the ones that were never supposed to reach you, subscribe and hit the notification bell so you don't miss what's coming next. Thank you for watching.